Mahatma Gandhi supposedly once remarked that Western civilization would be a good idea, suggesting that the West was backward and uncivilized. Well, Gandhi was wrong. The West is the best. Why do you think everyone wants to move here? But when they do move here, they bring the worst aspects of their own culture with them and create ghettos, supplanting the original culture. The left then supports and encourages these ghettos because they believe in cultural relativism.
Hey there everyone. So, the culture war. Yeah, I already know this is gonna be one of those 70% to 30% like to dislike ratio videos. Because it's actually controversial and not because some butthurt commies shared it on our Chapo Trap House and organized a failed raid. For those of you who aren't aware, though I can't imagine that most of you aren't considering the publicity that this has seen, there is a large debate going on in regards to cultural identity, mostly through the media between the American and European alt-right, along with the more conservative statist types, and a plethora of different groups who have a variety of different views on the matter. The former's position can be pretty much summarized by the clip of Paul Joseph Watson used in the introduction of this video. Political views influence a society's culture, and political views are shaped by the culture people originate from, and people from countries with more expansive governments are predisposed to more authoritarian views, which will in turn transform the societies they migrate to through the electoral process. Therefore, the state not trying to control the kinds of people entering the society in question through strict immigration laws will result in it resembling the countries where the new migrants came from. Whereas the latter is, well, a large range of perspectives on the matter that can't necessarily be summarized in such a quantified manner, which is an important thing to note because when discussing this issue, the first thing the former crowd will attempt to do is construct a false dichotomy in which if you don't support nationalist, populist, paleo-Luddism, trademark, then you're a globalist, which, in the way they use the term, is someone who believes that immigration laws should be abolished, and as a result, nation-states should merge into one global government. Yeah, so if you can't already tell, I'm not really a huge fan of how this topic of discussion generally is structured in mainstream discourse. Not just that I have strong disagreements, and believe me, I do, as I'm about to elaborate on, but seemingly with all subjects of debate in mainstream media, the debate of Western culture and its political ramifications is muddied up quite a bit with misleading euphemisms, equivocation, along with meaningless jargon which is designed to poison the well and fallaciously lead people to conclusions which don't logically follow from the argument being proposed, and obscurantism which is vague enough to not have any concrete meaning, but designed to be broad enough in application to where as many people as possible can use these terms and project their own meanings onto them. A great example being the phrase Western culture, or just culture in general. What do these terms even mean? It's not just difficult to describe what the ideas represent, but difficult to define the fundamental concept to start with. In this case, because of the snug assertions made by the culture warriors designing the premise of their arguments. And that's more or less the problem. Because the terms themselves and the way they're being used are dubious from the start, you have to have an entire discussion before the discussion just to try and have a common understanding of what's even being discussed in order to have a remotely productive conversation regarding the substance of the original position. Meaning that you can't actually debate the original topic because every single new point has to be debated as they're brought up. Which makes it all the more ironic that culture warriors refer to their dissenters as cultural relativists, since their entire position hinges upon using meaningless buzzwords and engaging in equivocation to try and redefine words in order to make what they're arguing for sound more reasonable than it really is. Which leads me to my first and most important point, which is essentially where their argument falls apart. Cultural identity does not exist. Now, this isn't to say that culture doesn't have any measurable effects on society, or that culture doesn't matter, but that observing or attempting to describe culture as an identity is nonsensical, both because this is conceptually flawed and demonstrably false. Cultures are a collection of various different ideas, social norms, and attitudes towards certain behaviors or actions. So, a culture is determined by the people that are living in the specific society in question. This necessarily must mean that culture is not a static, monolithic body of customs, as culture warriors attempt to make it out to be, because individual preferences and behaviors influence the culture, and these marginal traits are influenced by a countless number of different factors, which vary in an infinite number of ways based on an infinite number of variations. But more generally, behavior and culture must then be influenced by environment, because a society's environment is one of the few factors which affect an aggregate majority of the population. So, how materials are managed, government restrictions on trade and property associations, etc. We know that environment is a factor in behavioral development because neurons have been observed on a microscopic level forming large-scale changes through cortical remapping in response to various activity-dependent plasticity, so that different parts of the brain can become more active in order for the individual in question to better adapt to their surroundings. This process is more commonly known as neuroplasticity. And cultural changes being directly influenced by environments without any significant demographic shifts are incredibly common throughout history and can be observed in numerous different instances. The most famous and broad example, at least in relation to American politics, would be the original Jamestown settlement's first economic model from 1607 to 1610, and its second economic model, which was implemented in Plymouth in 1620. During the first implementation of the economic model, 80% of the colonists died within a single year. Violent crime and theft was rampant, along with disease. This was mostly caused by the scarcity created by the economic model in question, which was initially centered around the feudal system adopted widely in Europe at the time, being that Jamestown settlers were sent by the London Company on an expedition. So essentially, all of the land was owned by a centralized monopoly on arbitration, and there was absolutely no direct incentive for people to do anything other than sponge off of the resources being sent from England by the London Company. Then, the next settlement in Plymouth slightly modified this model to where private speculation wouldn't be restricted, and land would be owned by individuals in the settlement rather than the colony's microstate. And within less than a month, living conditions greatly improved, crime rates dropped significantly, as well as disease and life expectancy. Culture warriors also tend to baselessly assert that an increase in immigration correlates with changes in cultural norms and attitudes, which, if taking the previous point into consideration, should now seem self-evidently nonsensical. However, just so I can cover my bases and be as concise as possible, there is no conclusive evidence showing this to be the case, and every study on the matter, unsurprisingly, shows the exact opposite in every measure, which is that immigrants generally tend to assimilate into the society that they've moved into in terms of identity and socializing. Another problem with their argument is that it assumes voting can actually achieve political change. As shown in a study conducted by Princeton along with other organizations, the Princeton study being the most famous, this is not the case. Consistently, in every country which has an electoral system of government, the likelihood of a law passing is not even remotely affected by its support in polling. Each law has the exact same likelihood of passing, which is about 30 to 31% give or take. Whereas if you're polling only politicians and politically connected interest groups, the likelihood of a law passing is identical to its popularity. So if the outcome of legislation is demonstrably not affected by voting, demographic change, even if it was a thing that actually happened, wouldn't affect the laws of any country. But bottom line, the fundamental problem, aside from the warped view and explanation on their part of what culture is the culture warriors' attempt to assign universal values and preferences to people immigrating to a new country arbitrarily, and as demonstrated, this is just simply not accurate. And the reason I bring this up is that this is the point which particularly infuriates me about these people. The culture warrior idea of how culture functions is not possible to be consistently believed, since it implies that human behavior is deterministic, since that is what would have to be the case in order for culture to be static and unchanging. And they then argue that they're a counterculture, so even they don't believe this retarded bullshit. A popular line of rhetoric which these people use a lot is politics is downstream from culture, but actually culture is downstream from politics, which is ultimately where the culture warriors fail the hardest. At this point, most people wouldn't deny that there is a problem in our culture. What that problem is, however, is debated heavily. But generally, people in American and European cultures have developed serious issues with self-reliance, financial management, incentive to actually be productive, controlling their impulses, and a chronic lust for expanding the influence of the state over society because they think that this will accommodate their current lifestyle choice. And the state is directly to blame for this by inflating the currency through fractional reserve banking, by creating arbitrary restrictions in the market to cartelize it so only a few politically connected corporatists can become producers, and in turn create artificial scarcity which makes the real cost of commodities increase, and also through these same restrictions making it more difficult to find employment because of usury laws which make it more difficult to become a producer, and minimum wage laws which make it more difficult to find employment. Our quality of life declines and people have become dependent on the state simply because the state has largely robbed them of the ability to live independently from it. So it's not that there isn't a problem in our culture that's closely tied to politics, it's that the criticism is misdirected as a result of not properly assessing what's at fault. This is the reason why third world countries, for example, are in such despair, not because the people living there have simply chosen to live like that, as the culture warrior argument implies. It's because their society has an infrastructure which makes it impossible to secure a stable living for themselves within the legal markets due to their governments. If people within our culture were able to freely associate and were self-reliant, they'd naturally be incentivized to do as much as they could for others and vice versa. Otherwise, nobody's ends would be able to be met. Anyway, that's all for today's video. If you liked it, please comment, rate, and subscribe, and I will see you all next time.